One of the readings this week comes from Irenaeus, the church father. He wrote in the 2nd century and was the bishop of Lyon in what's currently France, I believe. Irenaeus, it's sort of misleading for us to talk about his book as being against heresies. That's what he was doing. But what's useful for it now is the fact that we tend to think of heresies as being something really far in the past, Gnosticism or whatever, Marcionism, and so we don't need to worry about it so much. But in fact, we do, because the challenges that the heretics brought, that Irenaeus had to encounter and deal with, actually are really valuable for us today. The first being that it actually really matters that we have some authentic tradition, some authentic apostolic tradition. That the truth that we have from the apostles is always and everywhere the truth of the Christian church. Now, Christianity, especially in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, has tended to devalue this. You may know the sola scriptura, scripture alone, being one of the battle cries of the Reformation. And this was because at the time of the Reformation, it was thought by people like Martin Luther and John Calvin that the Roman Catholic Church and the magisterium had gotten too far away from the foundational texts, the scriptures, and become too invested in traditions that were not in keeping with the witness of the Gospels, the witness of the letters, witness of the whole scriptures. And so there was a sense, well, if we just get back to the text, we'll be fine. Now, the problem that Martin Luther and company did not foresee was the advent of critical scholarship in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century. The advent of critical scholarship really challenged a lot of our certainty about the texts, their authorship, whether or not we have the final form, what the actual text is. You can pick up a copy of Metzger's textual commentary on the New Testament. You can see that there's disagreement on our earliest manuscripts about what the original text of the New Testament actually is. So, for example, was it Mark 15, the last chapter of Mark? The last section, the resurrection, it's said to be appended to the original gospel. That and depending on how radical scholarship wants to get, there'll be the sense that Mark is the first gospel, and Mark didn't even have an account of the resurrection. It was made up after the fact, and you'll get these really radical reconstructions of the faith that end up actually sounding quite a bit like the heresies of the Gnostics and Marcion. What's happened is critical scholarship has unearthed enough confusion or concern about the origins of the text, its accuracy, and blah 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 blah, to the point that people aren't certain any longer that we can A, trust them, and B, that there's like a coherent theology to be derived from the scriptures. And the first thing's challenging enough that can we really trust these texts? The second, even if we can trust them, do they even have a unified witness? And this was the challenge of quote-unquote New Testament theology. Does Peter agree with James? Does he agree with Matthew? Do they agree with the author of Hebrews, who in fact, who was the author of, say, the Deutero-Pauline, what is that what they call them? The latter part of the Pauline corpus, like that some people think that Titus and 1st, 2nd Timothy, Ephesians, some others weren't actually written by Paul. How do we know? I mean, it's even if you can get past whether or not we know who wrote them, do we really know what? Do they all really agree? Is there like a unified theology embedded in the New Testament? Now, I'll leave it to to the New Testament classes to answer some of these questions, but suffice to say that there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of concern. What do the scriptures actually say, and are they trustworthy? Well, interestingly enough, what Irenaeus explains is that the early challengers of the Christian faith had exactly the same arguments. They had their own gospels. There's the Gnostic gospels, writings that scholarship tends to agree much later than the texts of the New Testament, but not all of them. And there's certainly some question. Gospel of Thomas, they had their own scriptures. They had their own ways of reading the scriptures that we've got. they were able to come up with different interpretations, and they sort of wedded their Gnostic readings of the text to Gnostic theology and Neoplatonic philosophy, and they kind of came up with this amalgam that was similar but different from traditional Christian faith. And so there's that question, like, what do we do with that? Well, Irenaeus is unequivocal. He says the good news is that we've got the church. And the church always and everywhere has had the same proclamation. It's the proclamation that Jesus gave to the apostles, that they faithfully handed down, that has been faithfully protected, preserved, that I can write out for you. And he has various formulations of this. We call it rule of faith, regula fide. Different ways of kind of telling the big story, as it were, of who God is and what God has done. And we know it's trustworthy, not because we have the best exegesis of the Gospel of John, where we take everything that John says in context, and so therefore we're able to say definitively that this is the only one possible meaning of the intent of John, the author of the Gospel. No, not because of that. That's helpful. That's good. But we actually have a tradition. And Irenaeus actually, he traces his lineage. He's like, I sat at the foot of, Polycarp or whomever, and Polycarp was actually at the foot of John, or one of the apostles. He literally says, I'm basically the grandson in the faith of one of the men who lived, walked, witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, and died as a martyr to defend it. That's how close I am temporally. And I know, because Polycarp was a faithful man who lived a faithful life, I know that he wasn't lying when he told me what John said, or whomever it was. And moreover, when I have this teaching and I line it up right next to the scriptures, I see the deep agreement, the deep paralleling between what I have been told by those whom I trust, and what I see in these texts. Apostolic doctrine is authentic, and apostolic doctrine led to a community of people who are able to read the scriptures right because they know who Jesus was, because they were told by people they trusted. And then when they take that conception of Jesus, they see that reflected in the scriptures. When they take the big story of creation, fall, and redemption, they see that story reflected in the scriptures. They have a framework for what it is to be Christian. And what they see is that framework is deepened and lengthened and expanded and broadened as the community takes these sacred texts and reads into them. I'm an evangelical, so at the end of the day, I definitely want to stand and fall on the Bible. I think that we don't go away from the Bible, and the churches that do, I think ultimately are very much in danger of getting farther and farther away from that kind of apostolic doctrine. And part of that is because, when Irenaeus is writing, he's temporally much closer to Jesus than we are. And he was aware of people who literally knew the disciples. So there's a temporal distance that he doesn't have that we do, that I think makes us far more dependent on Scripture than Irenaeus is. But that notion of a trustworthy interpretive community, I think that is just as operative now as it was when Irenaeus is writing. And I think that in a lot of ways we can conceive of true church as just that authentic apostolic interpretive community. It's the whatever group, wherever you find them, of people who faithfully carry the picture of Jesus as King, and then try to work that out in conversation with our sacred text and in the contexts we find ourselves in life. That's a pretty broad notion of what the church is, and you would think that if that's kind of more or less what you think of as true church, then you would probably be, like I am, very much in favor of ecumenical unity. Ecumenism ecumenism is just the notion that the Church Catholic, little c, is truly Catholic. It's universal. Any group of people who are like this are true church. And we do have a lot of divisions, and we have a lot of substantive disagreements. And I mean, I think in this course we've established a lot of those, and we've had a lot of different people come from a lot of different places and have really substantive, deep, doctrinal disagreements, and that's okay. And it is one of the challenges to ecumenism because if you've noticed over the history of the church, these challenges have caused divisions and splits. And with good reason. I mean, if you believe in infant baptism and I believe in believer baptism, we probably aren't going to be able to baptize the same way. Agreed. But I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed this too, in my family, the people that I have the most, vehement disagreements with tend to be the people I'm closest to. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One of which is that I would much rather, when I'm hanging out with my cousins who largely reject, the church and religion in general, I just kind of want to get along with them. I want to just kind of present Christianity as a positive thing to them, get them a little more interested in Jesus than they were, before we had the conversation. That's about as far as I'm willing to go with them. And so our interactions are pretty anodyne. It's pleasant. We enjoy each other's company, but we're not, overturning. I'm not picking any fights, because what's the point? However, when I'm with people in my family who are committed to the church in the way that I am, I find that we can sometimes get in some very heated disagreements. What do we do with this issue that's facing the church today? Well, it should be like this. No, it should be like that. Shouting matches. I mean, tears. We disagree most strongly with people with whom we share the most. That's just a human thing. You're going to fight harder with your sibling or your spouse than you are with somebody that you don't know, because you share a lot, because you've got a lot in common, and so those differences that you have are pronounced and they're jagged and they rub. And I think this has happened in the church, and it's something that ecumenism has to overcome, is the recognition that, the reason that we have these disagreements that are so vehement, so violent, is because we actually have way more in common than we're giving credit to. Now, I think that, this is me speculating here, but I think that as we move into an increasingly post-Christian first world West, this is going to recede. Our cultural context is radically different. 50, 60 years ago, the difference between being a Presbyterian and a Methodist was massive. If you look, and to say nothing of Catholic and Protestant, I mean, wars have been fought, yes, in order to say this one versus this one. That's pretty serious disagreement. I find it absolutely telling that nobody is fighting wars anymore about Catholics versus Protestants, much less, Methodists versus Presbyterians or evangelicals versus whomever. More and more, as the culture at large becomes more and more secular, rejects religious faith in general, as that context becomes more and more our context, as secularism rises, there is a battening down of the hatches, that the things that divide us become less and less important, because it becomes clearer and clearer that I have much more in common with my Pentecostal charismatic neighbor than I do with my atheist, friend. And those agreements that we have matter much, much more, because they shape a world that is much closer. The world that I see and the world that my Pentecostal charismatic evangelical friend shares, there are differences, but they are much less than the differences that I have with my friends who are not religious at all. Moreover, those lead to substantive disagreements about the way life ought to be lived. I have much less in common in my notion of how life ought to be and what the world ought to be like with people with whom I share nothing theologically, than with those with whom overall, at the end of the day, we agree a lot more than we disagree. And that is only going to increase as Christians and people of faith feel more and more like a minority, feel more and more like they have no say, they have no influence. More and more, that's going to be the case. I have a friend who was a part of, back in the 1980s, was a part of Operation Rescue. Now, this friend was on one of the first waves of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, and was virulently anti-Catholic when he was in the Navy. He was on the front lines with Operation Rescue, which was an attempt by evangelicals and Christians of good conscience at the time to make public policy to outlaw abortion, or to stop abortion in the United States in the wake of Roe versus Wade. What my friend found was that he had comrades in arms with Roman Catholics of good conscience. That they had way more in common than they had not in common, and that was brought out by what both perceived as a cultural attack on faith. Now, whatever you think about abortion or Operation Rescue or whatever your opinions about that are, the point remains that when the culture pushes against people of faith, and people of faith who formerly thought they were very far off recognize that, boy, we sure are on the same side here, I think what we're going to see is an increased need and an increased desire for ecumenical unity. And I think that's a good thing. As much as I wonder if some of the pain of moving into a post-Christian environment can be used by God in the power of the Spirit to bring about something that Irenaeus was passionate about, and which I think we ought to be passionate about, and that is the unity of those who profess historically orthodox Christian faith, always and everywhere. What Ben Franklin said. We must hang together, or we shall hang together, or we shall hang separately, something like that. It might be that one of the good things that happens as the culture at large becomes more secular is that the church, even though she seems to shrink, may become closer together. They become one.